Hi everyone, welcome to another Docker container video. In this tutorial, we'll set up Jenkins Master Slave on AWS EC2 containers. Jenkins is a continuous integration, continuous deployment tool, and in traditional IT world, you might have seen Jenkins Master on one node and Jenkins slaves on separate servers. So left hand side is basically traditional IT world. And now let's imagine the situation where you might need to set up Jenkins master slave cluster at the enterprise level, where central Jenkins might be supporting thousands of jobs, and each team might need their own slave. For example, there might be a Java team or Python team. They might need their own Jenkins slaves. Uh, so in that scenario, you might end up spinning up hundreds of Jenkins slaves because they are not dynamic in nature. That means they don't spin up and spin off once job is done. So that is not a cost-effective or scalable model. Now let's take a example of right side, which is Docker containers. And I would highly recommend setting up Jenkins on Docker containers. The benefit of that scenario is that that model is dynamic in nature. That means you set up Jenkins master on one container on one node and Jenkins slaves on different node. So as soon as a particular job starts execution, and that particular job might be associated with a particular container. So the container will spin up at the runtime, and once job is completed, that container will spin off. That means that container will go away. So that means the cost or you can say utilization of resources is very effective as compared to the model one. You can have maybe this particular Docker, because they are spinning up and spinning down at the runtime. You can set up thousands of you can say slaves on very small number of servers. So the point is the infra footprint for Docker container setup will be much smaller than infra footprint of a traditional IT world. So being said that, target of this video is to set up Jenkins master on Docker containers. And trust me, if you follow this video, at the end of the video, you'll have Jenkins master setup on Docker containers. So during this tutorial, we will cover setting up EC2 master and slave nodes. I'll set up only 2 nodes for the sake of the video. You can set up as many as you want using Terraform. And then we'll configure the appropriate softwares, for example, Docker and all the appropriate users. After that, we'll set up the Jenkins master, and then we'll configure 2 Jenkins slaves. And in the end, I'll show you the demo by setting up 2 Jenkins jobs. Each job will be running on on a different container. So I'm assuming a couple of things. One is you might, because if you're using Terraform and you are setting up everything from scratch, so I'm assuming that you have Terraform on your local machine or your build machine, whatever you think you will be using to spin up the AWS servers. And you know the basics of AWS and Terraform. And it is okay if you are not using AWS, you can set up the same setup on Google Cloud, Microsoft Azure, even on VMware or bare metal servers, because they are Docker containers, and that is the beauty of Docker. You can build once and you can deploy it anywhere. And then you must know the basics of Docker commands. You can go through YouTube, on YouTube, or you can go through the documentation to understand those commands. We need to open a couple of ports. One is 2376 because that is the port on which Docker API will listen. Then 22 port SSH port between master and slave, and 88 is HTTP port basically to access the Jenkins master UI. So let's start our first step, which is EC2 server setup. I would say I'll not go through every step because that is something you can go through this video. I have covered that previously. So you can clone this particular repo, and once this repo is cloned on your local machine, you can use Terraform apply to spin up the servers. So Terraform apply will create two EC2 servers, and if you check the code which is here, sorry about that. Alright, so if you check the code on the Git, so this is doing nothing but executing all the Terraform resources available in the infra code, which is part of this repo itself. For example, variables has all the variables, and the public.tf has the two EC2 servers and all the ports which will be opened between master and slaves. So once that step is complete, you can see we can log into AWS, and we can see we have two servers. One is Jenkins Master, second is Jenkins Agent. We'll use Master to set up the master. Once your servers are provisioned, go to the next step, which is setting up the softwares and users. Log into the server using this particular command, sh. You can use PAM file to log in, or if you have the role, that is great. So let's go to the master, 239. Okay, we are inside the server now. Then you install the Docker and restart the Docker service, Docker daemon service. You need to create the Jenkins user so that you can start the Docker container using Jenkins server. And you need to add the Jenkins inside the Docker group so that you can freely execute the Docker commands through Jenkins user. You need to note down this UID. This is very important. I'll let you know later on why we need this ID. And change the password of Jenkins and enable the password login on EC2 server. You can modify this particular script as a root and restart the SSD. Once this job is done, either you can set up these steps on one server, create the AMI of that server, and then launch all the slaves machine using that particular AMI. That's what I did. Or you can create a script which will have all these steps and use that script inside the Terraform provisioner so that you don't need to set up this again and again. So once these steps are completed on both the machines, we need to set up the Jenkins master. So we are already inside the Jenkins master. We need to execute these commands. And the first one is change the ownership of var lib in Jenkins. This is the local directory on the host machine, and this will be mapped to the volume inside the Docker containers. It is not absolutely necessary and optional, but it is always good to make sure that you mount the local directory inside the Docker container, because as soon as your Docker goes away, all the directories and files inside the Docker container will also go away. But if you mount that outside the Docker container, then you can retain the data and all the files. For example, we are mounting it on var lib Jenkins. So anything which will be inside var Jenkins underscore home will be available at var lib and Jenkins on the local machine. So we'll execute this command. After that, you need to switch to Jenkins user and then command docker run and this particular command. Docker run is basically it pulls the image if that image is not there on the local machine. If it is there, then it doesn't pull from the dockyard or remote artifactory or remote repo. If that image is not there, it will pull from the remote repo, which is dockyard in our case. This is the image name. And then name is basically name of the Docker container. -u is the UID. Remember I told you to note down the ID of Jenkins user. This is what why we need that. Without this, you'll get a lot of permission issues. -d is the detached. It will run this command in the background, and -v is the volume. You need to mount this volume, and I already explained why do you need to mount it. -p is the port. This is the port we expose. Once this command is run, because I already run that on the Docker container, so I'll not run it again, but you can check if Jenkins is running or not. Let's go to sudo su Jenkins docker ps, and you can see all the Docker's containers which are running. We have the master. Now once this step is completed, we have the container for master which is running up and running. Now you can use the browser to log into Jenkins. Host IP, which is the public IP basically. You can use the private IP if you have the access on your network, but use the public IP and 8080 on browser. When you log in first time, it will ask you to get you the password, which will be the default password. You can get it from this particular directory inside the Docker container. And this is how you can log into the Docker container. Docker execute IT and name of the Docker container and bash, and you can access this file and put the password. Once that is done, it will prompt you to install all the suggested plugins. I would say install all the default plugins, and then reset the admin username and password. Once that is done, you need to install the Docker plugin. This is the most important plugin because we need that for Docker master slave setup. You can go to manage Jenkins, manage plugins, and search for Docker plugin and install it. Once that job is done, and just to let you know that we can go to manage Jenkins, configure system, we don't need to go to configure system, I'm sorry for that. We need to go to manage plugins basically. And because I already installed it, you can see the Docker plugin. The reason I'm showing it because this plugin is very important. Without this, you cannot set up the Docker clouds, slaves clouds. So once this is installed, restart the Jenkins and you should be good. You can see these two jobs. We'll be using that for demo, but I'm showing you all the steps. Once that is done, our master setup is done, and congratulations, we are almost done and we are very close to complete setup. Once that is done, we'll go to the Docker slave setup. So log into the second node, which is Docker agent. We'll come out of it. And we need to set up the Docker API so that it can listen on 2376 port, because this will be the port where Docker API or the master Docker container will communicate with the slaves containers. So slaves container should run on this particular IP. So you need this step is applicable for EC2 Linux servers. Ubuntu, these steps might be different, but search for how to configure the Docker API on Ubuntu. You'll find it very easily. But for EC2 Linux servers, you can follow these steps. Open this file and update the options basically, and add this line. Please make sure that you replace the private IP with the private IP of the EC2 servers. For example, this one. This is the private IP. Once that is done, you need to restart the Docker daemon. Once Docker daemon is restarted, you can check the Docker is whether Docker is started perfectly or not. You can see the Docker daemon or API is listening on 2376 port. Once that step is completed, we need to go to Docker Master, Jenkins Master. Go to Jenkins Master, click on Manage Jenkins, Configure System, And if your Docker plugin is installed, you'll see this option, add a new cloud. Click on that, Docker container, and will not set up. I'll show you how I set up. So it will prompt you to enter the name, enter the Docker, then enter the Docker host URL. That will be the TCP private IP of the agent, which is in our case the slave machine, and the port on which Docker API is running. Click on enabled and click on test connection. If it is working fine, it will give you the API version, and that means it is able to communicate to the Docker slave on 2376 port. For example, if you put 5 and click on test connection, it won't work. Leave everything else default, and then you need to set up the Docker agent template. That is the template which tells you from which particular image you need to start the Docker slave. So label is where which will be used for jobs. So in the jobs, you'll mention which particular Docker slave you want to use for execution. So set up the label accordingly. Click on enable, provide a appropriate name for the slave, and this is very important, Docker image. So you might need a Java container, you might need a Python or Ruby container or Ruby slave. So based on the type of slave you need to put that Docker image. You can build your own custom images, or you can download from internet, or you can get it from within your company, or the point is use the appropriate image so that everything works fine. Then you can set up the directory where everything will be executed, and click on this. It is okay to select any of the options based on the requirement, but I selected this one so that I can mention which jobs will be running on this container. And then user should be Jenkins, and once that is done, click on save and apply. We configured 2 slaves basically, slave 1 and slave 2. And once that is done, I think we are done, and let's go to the final step, which is Jenkins job setup. And in this step, we'll show that the both jobs are configured to run on different containers. Click on configure. So this job is running on Docker slave 1, Jenkins slave 1. And the second job is running on different slave 2. And if you see our machine, agent machine, which is this one, Docker PS, you don't see, I'm sorry for that, su Jenkins Docker PS, you see that there is no container running on the slave machine. That means this machine is sitting idle because there is no job execution happening on this. There are no containers. As soon as we trigger the job, let's say click on build now, it will say that it is waiting for Jenkins slave to come up. So this container is offline. It brings the container, complete the job, and you can see the host name of the container, and it completes the job. And you can see there is nothing running on this particular host. Now let's go to second job. Click on that. This is Java container. It will go to slave 2, which is Docker container 2 basically. And if you see the console output, we can see the Java version. That means this is a different image and different container than the previous one. We are getting Java version on this container. So that's pretty much. I think this will give you very good understanding, and if you follow the steps, as I said, you'll be able to set up the Jenkins Master Slave on containers, on Docker containers. And feel free to leave the comments, and if you like the video, please comment on the like, and leave your comments. If you're stuck anywhere, I'll be happy to help you guys. Thank you very much.